Hegel lived from 1770 to 1831, which was a period of extraordinary intellectual creativity in Germany, generally. As a young man, he trained for the Protestant ministry in the seminary at Tübingen, but the experience of preaching a sermon or two quickly persuaded him that he was not called to be a Lutheran minister. He was a very bad preacher. He was a very bad public speaker in general. And like so many young intellectuals of that time, he went on to become a house tutor for wealthy families. Whilst he was in the Protestant seminary at Tübingen, the Stift, he actually shared a room with the very great, mad, but very great poet Friedrich Hölderlin, who was a great friend of his, and also the infant prodigy of German philosophy, Friedrich Wilhelm Schelling. There were these three extraordinarily brilliant people sharing a room there. Schelling went on very quickly to become extremely famous, although he was several years younger than Hegel. Hölderlin didn't, but wrote these extraordinary, tortured poems. Hegel started out, whilst working for aristocratic families as a tutor to their children, he started out with the ambition of becoming a religious reformer. So he wrote a series of essays focusing upon the story of Jesus, trying to retell the life of Jesus. Initially, from the point of view of straightforward Enlightenment rationalism, and trying to present Jesus as if he were a Kantian philosopher. However, increasingly as he went on, he became dissatisfied with that approach and eventually came to the conclusion that he would have to become a philosopher. And he spent a long period of his life in his 20s and 30s struggling to get a position in a university and on the whole failing. This was a period when university life was struggling in Germany. The old universities were, many of them in a state of great decay. There was a sudden new burst of university life just beginning, and the University of Berlin, at which Hegel eventually became the second professor of philosophy, was part of this new surge in German university life. But this was the period of the Napoleonic Wars, and Germany was in chaos. And Hegel's life story for a long time was one of being very, very poor and bitter at seeing people he regarded as fools getting jobs that he ought to get, but he wasn't getting them. Partly because he was a useless lecturer, and partly because he wrote in this tortured way that wasn't terribly accessible. And anyhow, it took him a long time, finally, to arrive in terms of his career. And, but eventually he did, and he became professor of philosophy in Berlin, and during the 1820s, he became a great power in the land, to such an extent that he was able to dream of a new world in which he would be the person who wrote the curriculum for philosophy, which would be the governing discipline of the new German university world, in the way that theology once upon a time had been the governing discipline of universities, but now it would be philosophy, and it would moreover be the philosophy taught according to his curriculum. That was his dream. It was never fulfilled. And it evoked a lot of resentment. A lot of people are very hostile to Hegel because they resent that ambition. But at the time, one can see why one might have thought that was a good idea. What kind of a person was Hegel? To me, it's always very important what kind of a person a thinker is from a theological point of view. And I'm glad to say that Hegel is somebody I think I would have liked. Although he was a person who was clearly damaged by the stress of and the struggle of his life and his long period, as he felt, in the wilderness. Politically, this was a time of terrific surge of German nationalism in response to the Napoleonic invasions, and a lot of very enthusiastic dreams of a new Germany. A lot of the students were caught up in this in reaction against France, but also, I'm afraid to say, for the first time, really militantly anti-Semitic. And Hegel, I'm glad to say, was completely allergic to this form of nationalism. And in the 1820s in Berlin, he was very clearly identified as a friend of Jews. It's not something that he wrote polemically about, but he was. And the people that he most of all hated were these demagogues, philosophers who lent their philosophical authority to the politics of anti-Semitic German nationalism. He was kind of liberal. He sympathized to some extent with what Napoleon stood for, that's to say enlightened laws, systematized laws, an end to feudal privilege, and civil rights for all, including Jews. So he was kind of liberal in that world, and he had a degree of civil courage in Prussia in the 1820s. That wasn't an entirely comfortable position to defend. He mixed this with a very distinctive attitude to religion. Was Hegel devout is an interesting question. The answer is no, not in any conventional sense. He did once say that for the modern man, reading the morning newspaper had taken the place of matins. And I think that was very much his attitude. And yet, he's a man of, in another sense, very intense religious passion. But it's a passion for thoughtfulness, for systematic, open-minded, thoughtful criticism of everything, a refusal to rest content with unthought-through prejudices, and he was extremely impatient with any sort of sentimentality in religion. Sentimental piety enraged him. So there's something prophetic about Hegel, and yet he wasn't a prophet exactly because he was a philosopher. There is a kind of prophetic rage. I'm a great admirer of the prophet Amos. There's something of the prophet Amos in Hegel, but it's been completely transformed into philosophy. It ceased to be sheer rage and has become this absolutely intense dedication to thinking things through. So that's yeah, in that sense he was devout. Hegel was not only a very bad preacher, he was a very bad lecturer. He was extremely wooden, had no flair, and yet there was something mesmerizing about his lectures because of the sheer intensity of thoughtfulness in them that people found quite electric, despite, in terms of sheer delivery, he had an ugly voice with a heavy Swabian accent, he didn't enjoy the public performance element in it. As a personality, Hegel was very introverted. He could relax and he could be quite jolly, and he loved a good game of whist, preferably with people he didn't have to talk philosophy with. But his life had, he suffered terribly from stress, and in his later years became quite despotic with his friends, quite painfully so. In a way, his thinking is a wrestling with that side of his personality, I think. His thinking is not despotic, his thinking is profoundly liberating, but it's mixed with political passions that arose out of painful personal conflicts. And so there he is as a colleague of Friedrich Schleiermacher at the University of Berlin, this brilliant preacher, this charming man, this easygoing character, who at the same time was much too easily seduced by romantic dreams of Germany. Hegel loathed it. He tried very hard to be amicable towards Schleiermacher, but they were the leaders of two opposing parties and they didn't get on at all. They were both of them in one sense liberals, but utterly different sorts of liberal. And from an Hegelian point of view, Schleiermacher's form of liberalism is shallow, glib. All this invocation of feeling, it's so apologetic, it lacks sufficient self-criticism, I think, would be Hegel's ultimate complaint. And it goes back partly to this, they're just incompatible personalities. When Hegel first became a philosopher, it was in the context of an intellectual world dominated by the great figure of Kant. And here is Kant, who is intent upon a religion within the limits of pure reason alone, which is the title of Kant's great book on religion. And it kind of summarizes his views. Kant wants to absolutely step outside religious tradition, has no loyalty to any church, wants to reduce religion to a minimum of straightforward ethical, moral, absolutely rational concerns, and then all the rest to be set completely to one side. Then, another key figure in the background is Fichte, who was the first professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin before Hegel. And Fichte was a disciple of Kant who decided to be much more radical. Fichte is in fact an extremely sinister figure. He was a brilliant speaker, absolutely great orator. And at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, he delivered these terrific speeches in Berlin, full of fire and thunder and patriotic uplift, a bit of anti-Semitism mixed in too. But